What if history's most powerful stories weren't written by kings or conquerors, but by those who were silenced? Hidden beneath the grand narratives of empires, there's another layer of truth scratched into clay tablets, whispered on parchment, preserved in the quiet defiance of those who were never meant to be heard. Today, we're uncovering the secret texts of enslaved historians, voices that refuse to be erased. These aren't just ancient words, they're acts of courage, smuggled through time to reach us. Think about the risk it took to write them, every stroke of the pen, every etched symbol, a potential death sentence. Yet they survived. Why? Because someone, somewhere, believed their stories mattered enough to hide them, to protect them, to ensure they'd outlast the chains of their time. Picture this: a scribe bound to serve a ruler, forced to record victories they didn't believe in. But in the shadows, they wrote something else, their own version of events, their own truths. These clandestine writings are more than historical footnotes. They're proof that even in the darkest moments, humanity finds a way to speak. From Mesopotamia to Rome, from the pyramids to the agora, enslaved historians left behind fragments of their world, not as their masters dictated, but as they lived it. Their words reveal the cracks in empires, the whispered rebellions, the quiet resistance of everyday people. And here's what's astonishing: many of these texts were hidden in plain sight, baked into bricks, tucked inside official records, even woven into the very architecture of power. So why does this matter to us today? Because history isn't just about the winners, it's about the voices that refuse to lose. These secret texts rewrite what we thought we knew, offering raw, unfiltered perspectives on love, loss, and survival. They remind us that resilience isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a single sentence carved into a wall, waiting centuries to be read. Over the next minutes, we'll follow these hidden messages across time, decoding their meanings and meeting the brave minds behind them. This isn't just a journey into the past, it's a conversation with it, and by the end you'll see history and humanity in a whole new light, ready to begin. Let's step into the shadows together. To understand the origins of these enslaved historians, we have to step back into the bustling scribble schools of Mesopotamia, where literacy was both a privilege and a shackle. Imagine a young boy taken from his homeland, trained meticulously in cuneiform, not to tell his own story, but to glorify kings and tally tribute. Yet, in the margins of temple inventories or beneath the lines of royal decrees, he and others like him left traces of their world. These weren't just clerks, they were covert chroniclers, using their masters' tools to etch their own truths into clay. In ancient Rome, enslaved Greek scholars faced a similar paradox. Their education made them invaluable to the elite, but it also gave them the power to record history differently. A slave might transcribe a senator's speech by day, then by night compose a private letter about the hunger riots outside the villa walls. What's striking is how their dual roles shaped the very nature of their writings. Official records boast of conquests and harvests, but their hidden accounts speak of famines, rebellions, and the quiet solidarity of the oppressed. Take the Babylonian slave who scribbled a prayer for freedom into a brick before it was baked. His words literally cemented into the empire's infrastructure. Or the Athenian servant who wove critiques of democracy into her mistress's poetry, knowing few would suspect a woman's hand behind the subversion. Literacy for them wasn't just survival, it was sabotage. They mastered the art of ambiguity, writing in dialects their overseers couldn't decipher, or burying dissent in metaphors. A list of temple offerings might double as a ledger of stolen grain. A hymn to a pharaoh could conceal the names of executed rebels. Their methods of concealment were as ingenious as they were daring. Some wrote on perishable materials, wax tablets smoothed clean after reading, or papyrus scraps hidden in amulets. Others relied on oral tradition, teaching their children coded songs that carried histories no parchment could safely hold. And then there were the collaborations, networks of enslaved cooks, messengers, and laborers who smuggled fragments of truth between plantations and prisons, stitching together a counter-narrative piece by piece. These weren't isolated acts, they were part of a silent war against erasure, fought one whispered word at a time. The sheer audacity of it all forces us to reconsider what we call history. For every grand inscription carved in stone, there's a hidden counterpart scratched in charcoal, sewn into cloth, or memorized in secret. These captive scribes didn't just witness history, they rewrote it from the inside, ensuring that even in chains, their voices would outlast empires. Consider the inventory list from a Sumerian temple, meticulously recording jars of oil and sacks of grain. At first glance, it's just bureaucracy, but look closer. Between the lines, the scribe has repeated the symbol for freedom in tiny, almost imperceptible strokes. To the overseer, it's a clerical record. To those who knew how to read it, it's a protest. This was the brilliance of coded language, saying everything while appearing to say nothing. One of the most striking examples comes from ancient Egypt, where an enslaved architect named Petis left behind a seemingly dry account of temple repairs. Buried in the measurements and materials, though, are references to stolen wages and forced labor phrases like, "the stones weep at dawn," or "the river runs backward," metaphors understood by fellow workers but meaningless to their overseers. Poetry became another powerful weapon. In Greece, enslaved scholars composed verses praising their masters' victories, but woven into the rhythm were lines from their homelands, folk tales about trickster gods outwitting tyrants. A hymn to Apollo might secretly echo a Lydian rebellion song, its melody carrying a message across generations. Even children's rhymes held dual meanings. A Babylonian nursery rhyme about the mouse who stole the crown was actually a satire about overthrowing kings passed down in whispers. These weren't just clever word games, they were survival tactics. A single misstep could mean execution, so the metaphors had to be flawless, layered enough to conceal, but clear enough to resonate. Perhaps the most audacious coding came from Rome, where enslaved historians like Epictetus wrote philosophy that slipped subversion into plain sight. His famous line, "No man is free who is not master of himself," sounds like Stoic wisdom, but to the enslaved it was a rallying cry. Even the formatting hid truths. One Pompeian tablet lists household expenses in neat columns, but the wax beneath bears the imprint of a previous message, scratched out hastily, a love letter between enslaved lovers, preserved by accident under the mundane. Scholars only discovered it by tilting the tablet under light, revealing the ghostly lines beneath. Decoding these texts today requires more than linguistic skill. It demands cultural intuition. Take the work of Dr. Amina Diakite, who realized that certain West African symbols in Roman-era mosaics weren't decorative. They were signatures. Enforced silence bred innovation, turning every available surface into a canvas, pottery shards, laundry tags, even the threads of textiles. A Coptic weaver in Byzantium stitched names of the dead into temple tapestries, their memories literally woven into the fabric of history. The more we uncover, the clearer it becomes. These writers weren't just hiding messages. They were building a bridge across time, trusting that someday someone would know how to listen. The Epic of Gilgamesh is often hailed as the crown jewel of ancient literature, a masterpiece carved into clay by anonymous hands. But what if those hands belonged not just to scholars, but to enslaved scribes, people who saw their own struggles reflected in Gilgamesh's journey? Look closely at the oldest surviving tablets, and you'll find something startling. The famous friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu takes on new meaning when you consider who might have written it. Enkidu, the wild man tamed and bound by civilization, speaks lines that echo the lived experience of captivity. They gave me clothes like a noble, but my skin remembers the shackles. Was this just poetic flourish, or a hidden commentary slipped in by someone who knew bondage firsthand? Scriptoria, the bustling workshops where scribes copied texts, were rarely places of freedom. Many of these writers were war captives or debt slaves, trained in cuneiform not for creative expression, but to serve temples and palaces. Yet in the repetitive act of copying, they found opportunities. A slight tweak to a phrase here, an extra stanza there. The standard version of the epic describes Gilgamesh's tyranny over Uruk, but some lesser-known fragments paint a sharper picture. One tablet from Nippur includes an unusual detail: citizens whispering complaints about forced labor as the king builds his walls. It's a fleeting moment, easily overlooked. But for an enslaved scribe, that addition would have been dangerous defiance. Even the epic's most universal themes, mortality, grief, the search for meaning, carried double edges when viewed through this lens. The lament for Enkidu's death, raw and visceral, resonates differently when imagined as a coded mourning for lost homelands or fallen comrades. And consider the flood story, where Utnapishtim survives catastrophe by following secret divine instructions. Could this have been a metaphor for the scribe's own survival strategies, learning to read the unspoken rules of power to endure? What's revolutionary about these interpretations isn't just rewriting literary history. It's recognizing that enslaved scribes weren't passive copyists. They were custodians of culture, shaping stories as they preserved them. A single altered word could carry generations of collective memory. When Gilgamesh fails to achieve immortality, the tablet famously concludes, "The life you pursue you shall not find." But the scribes, in their quiet rebellion, found something else, a way to make their own lives indelible. This pattern of hidden influence stretches far beyond Mesopotamia. In the temples of Egypt, where hieroglyphs were said to be the god's own writing, enslaved artisans left marks of their own. A cartouche might frame a pharaoh's name, but the pigment beneath it could tell another story, ground from stones only found in Nubia, a silent testament to the hands that mixed it. Next, we'll follow these traces southward, where the Nile's currents carried more than just water. They carried secrets inked in whispers. Egypt's scribbled tradition is often remembered for its grandeur pyramid blueprints, hymns to the gods, the meticulous accounting of a civilization that measured its wealth in grain and gold. But in the quiet spaces between those lines, where the ink thins and the papyrus fibers fray, another story emerges. Take the Laden Papyrus, a seemingly ordinary temple inventory from the 19th dynasty. On its surface, it lists offerings to Amun-Ra, linen, wine, sacrificial bulls, but tilt it toward the light, and you'll find faint strokes along the edges, a scribe's personal lament scrawled in haste. 10 years I have measured the Nile's rise, yet my own children hunger. The god's bread fills the altars while our bowls hold only dust. This duality was the lifeblood of Egypt's enslaved scribes. Trained in hieroglyphs and hieratic script, they wielded the tools of power while living under its heel. A single papyrus could serve two masters, the pharaoh's propaganda on one side, a worker's plea for mercy on the reverse. Consider the Turin Strike Papyrus, the oldest recorded labor protest in history. Officially, it documents rations for tomb builders, but read against the grain, it's a manifesto, a detailed account of wages withheld, of strikes organized under the nose of overseers. The scribe who penned it didn't just record events. He weaponized bureaucracy, turning a dry ledger into proof of collective resistance. What makes these texts so revolutionary isn't just their content, but their camouflage. Hieroglyphs themselves became a tool of concealment. A scribe might inscribe a royal decree with flawless formalism, then use the same symbols to hide subversive messages. The glyph for justice could be subtly altered to imply its absence. A hymn's repetitive chorus might encode the names of missing laborers. Even materials betrayed secrets. Scholars recently discovered that the red ink in some Ramesside decrees contained trace minerals from Nubia, evidence that enslaved pigment grinders, far from home, left their own signatures in chemistry. The risk of such acts was unimaginable. In a society where words were considered divine, altering them was akin to blasphemy, yet the scribes persisted. A fragment from Deir el-Medina recounts a trial where a literate slave was accused of twisting the sacred signs. His defense, he claimed he was merely practicing his penmanship. The irony was cutting. The very education forced upon him became his alibi. These fragments force us to rethink Egypt's narrative. For every towering monument proclaiming eternal glory, there's a potsherd in the rubble bearing a worker's tally, not of stone blocks hauled, but of days endured. The grandeur of the past was built on unspoken negotiations between power and those who documented it. A scribe's reed pen could etch a pharaoh's immortality into temple walls, but it could also, with a trembling hand, write the truth into the margins. Now, as we cross the Mediterranean to the Greco-Roman world, we'll find a different kind of rebellion, one where enslaved philosophers turned the master's language against him, where the act of recording history became an act of defiance. But that's a story etched not in papyrus but in the very foundations of Western thought. Greek and Roman slave historians didn't just witness history, they shaped it from the shadows. Picture a bustling villa in Pompeii where an enslaved tutor drills his young charge in Homeric verse by day, then under cover of darkness etches a single word into the plaster wall: libertas. Freedom. This dichotomy defined their existence, educated enough to document empires, yet bound by the very systems they recorded. While figures like Epictetus, who rose from chains to philosophical fame, dominate the historical spotlight, it's the anonymous voices that cut deepest. A charcoal scroll on a Pompeian bakery wall reads, "The master dines on peacock, we choke on dust," a stark counterpoint to the lavish frescoes celebrating Roman abundance. These weren't mere complaints, they were acts of historical sabotage, ensuring future generations would see beyond the marble facades. The archives of Rome teem with paradoxes. Enslaved secretaries transcribed Senate speeches lauding justice while drafting private letters about the screams from the ergastulum, the underground prison where rebellious laborers were broken. One fragment from Ostia, pressed into wax by an unknown hand, recounts a slave's whispered conversation with a visiting diplomat. You ask how Rome stands so tall. Count the bones in its foundations. Such texts force us to reread classical antiquity through a fractured lens. Official histories celebrate the Pax Romana, but the graffiti beneath tells of bread riots suppressed with gladiator battalions, of mothers selling children to pay tribute. Even the famed Roman roads, symbols of imperial unity, bear hidden marks, symbols scratched into mile markers by enslaved surveyors, mapping not distances but despair. Religion became both sanctuary and cipher for these covert chroniclers. In the catacombs beneath Rome, where enslaved Christians gathered illegally, prayers doubled as historical records. A 3rd century carving shows a fish, an early Christian symbol, but look closer. Its scales form tiny letters naming local persecutors. Elsewhere, a votive statue to Jupiter hides a lead-cursed tablet in its base, listing the crimes of a corrupt official. These spiritual spaces offered rare opportunities to preserve truth without immediate danger. The Temple of Isis in Pompeii reveals another layer, a mural of the goddess flanked by hieroglyphs that, when deciphered, include Nubian phrases meaning the scales will balance. For enslaved devotees, faith wasn't just solace. It was archival practice, embedding subversive histories in sacred contexts where few would think to look. Perhaps most poignant are the texts that survived by sheer accident. A wax tablet from Herculaneum, preserved by volcanic ash, records a shopping list in formal Latin, but when heated with modern technology, its underlying layers reveal a desperate plea: "Tell my sister in Neapolis I live." The mundane became the medium, as enslaved cooks tallied kitchen stores on tablets that later held love notes, or wove accounts of abuse into the pattern of a noblewoman's tapestry. These fragile testimonies survived precisely because they hid in plain sight, masquerading as the everyday debris of empire. What emerges from these fragments isn't just an alternate history of Greece and Rome, it's a masterclass in resistance through documentation. The enslaved tutor who taught Cicero's children also likely influenced their rhetoric. The scribe who recorded Augustus's decrees may have subtly shifted their phrasing. Their legacy whispers a radical truth. Even when barred from owning their own stories, they found ways to ink them into eternity. Now, as we turn to the role of religion in preserving these voices, we'll see how faith provided not just refuge, but a clandestine network for truth-telling across generations. Religion offered more than just spiritual solace. It became a covert archive for the oppressed. Imagine a dimly lit scriptorium in 3rd century Alexandria, where an enslaved copyist meticulously reproduces the Psalms. To his overseers, he's merely transcribing sacred words, but in the margins, with ink diluted to near invisibility, he chronicles the names of fellow believers dragged into the mines of Numidia. These weren't random additions, they were deliberate acts of preservation camouflaged as piety. Early Christian communities, often comprising enslaved and freed individuals, turned scripture into a vessel for hidden histories. A fragment of the Gospel of Mark discovered in Oxyrhynchus bears an unusual annotation beside the parable of the sower. Like seeds, we are buried but not lost. Forensic analysis revealed the handwriting differed from the main text, likely added by a scribe who saw their own struggle in the metaphor. The Babylonian exile provides another striking example. Jewish captives, many of them skilled scribes, were tasked with maintaining administrative records for their captors. Yet within these scrolls, they embedded subversive continuity. The Book of Lamentations, traditionally attributed to this period, reads as a communal elegy for Jerusalem, but certain acrostic poems contain coded patterns. When read vertically, letters spell out locations of hidden Torah scrolls or names of resistance leaders. Even the act of canonizing scripture became an act of defiance. Enslaved Levites preserving oral traditions ensured that songs of deliverance, like Miriam's victory hymn after crossing the Red Sea, were transcribed with meticulous care, transforming liturgy into living testimony. Archaeology continues to unveil these layered narratives. In the ruins of a Carthaginian basilica, researchers uncovered a 5th century lectionary, a book of scripture readings for worship. Beneath the gold leaf illuminations, ultraviolet imaging exposed charcoal underdrawings, sketches of ship rigging and measurements. Further study suggested an enslaved illustrator, likely a former sailor, had left traces of his past life beneath the holy images he was forced to create. Similarly, Coptic binding fragments from Egyptian monasteries reveal recycled papyrus earlier drafts of letters between enslaved families, repurposed as book spines. What clerics considered scrap, history now recognizes as sacred echoes. These discoveries rewrite our understanding of religious texts. A hymn book isn't just a liturgical tool, it's a palimpsest of human resilience. When a Byzantine chant mentions the tears of Hagar, it carries the weight of countless enslaved women who saw their reflection in Abraham's cast-out concubine. The very act of calligraphy could be transcendent, a scribe's meticulous strokes forming letters that outlasted empires, their hands guided by something beyond survival. Perhaps this is why so many of these texts endured. Those who safeguarded them, whether in monasteries, synagogues, or private devotion, understood they were preserving more than words. They were guarding the unbreakable link between faith and memory. Now, as we examine the tools and techniques that brought these hidden messages to light, prepare to witness how modern technology is resurrecting voices once thought lost to time, not through magic, but through the marriage of science and stubborn hope. Archaeology is pulling back the curtain on history's silenced voices, one painstaking excavation at a time. Take the Vindolanda tablets, thin slivers of wood unearthed near Hadrian's Wall, where the ink should have crumbled to dust centuries ago. Yet preserved in the anaerobic mud, these letters reveal the mundane and the monumental, requests for socks, complaints about cold weather, and between the lines, glimpses of enslaved scribes navigating their dual roles. One fragment, addressed to a fort's commander, ends with an abrupt shift in handwriting, as if a second, unpracticed hand took over mid-sentence. Scholars now believe this was the work of an enslaved assistant, his shaky letters betraying a rare moment where the invisible labor behind history becomes visible. But it's not just about what we find, it's how we find it. Multispectral imaging, a technique that captures light wavelengths beyond human vision, is resurrecting texts once considered lost. In the basement of the Vatican Library, researchers recently scanned a palimpsest, a manuscript scraped clean and reused. Beneath the medieval Latin prayers, the technology revealed an earlier layer, a Greek slave's account of Nero's reign, its ink faded to near nothingness. The scribe had written sideways across the page, a clever trick to maximize scarce parchment. His words, describing the Great Fire of Rome from the perspective of the enslaved firefighting brigades, contradict Tacitus's official version. This isn't just a recovered text, it's a counter-narrative hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. The real revolution lies in the everyday artifacts. Broken pottery shards called ostraca, often discarded as ancient scrap paper, are treasure troves of covert communication. In the ruins of a Roman villa in Gaul, archaeologists found a stack of these fragments, ostensibly shopping lists. But when pieced together, they formed a coherent plea. We who harvest your grapes ask for 1 day's rest in 7, as the Jews do. The handwriting varied slightly with each line, suggesting multiple authors collaborating in secret. Even the medium carried meaning. The shards came from amphorae produced in the writer's homelands, their clay a silent protest against cultural erasure. Yet every discovery comes with challenges: faded ink, damaged surfaces, and the biases of those who first catalogued these artifacts can distort interpretations. A tablet from Pompeii's gladiator barracks was long labeled as a training schedule until a linguist noticed its symbols matched graffiti found in enslaved quarters across the city. It wasn't a roster of fighters, it was a shift calendar for the men who cleaned their blood from the arena sand. Such reinterpretations force us to question what else we've mislabeled, what other voices we've filed away under the wrong names. The most poignant finds are those that defy functionality altogether. In a corner of Sardis's ancient synagogue, workers uncovered a lead scroll no larger than a pinky finger. Unrolled with microscopic care, it bore no official decree or inventory, just a single line in Aramaic. I, Darius, remember the taste of figs from my village. This tiny artifact, likely worn as an amulet, carries the weight of an entire life in exile. It reminds us that for every grand inscription chiseled into marble, there are countless whispers pressed into lead, scratched onto potsherds, or woven into cloth, waiting for the right tools and the right questions to bring them back into the light. Now, as we confront the complexities of piecing together these fragmented records, we'll see how scholars navigate the gaps between what was written, what was meant, and what we're only beginning to understand. The challenge isn't just reading the words, it's hearing the voices behind them. Deciphering these fragmented voices is like assembling a mosaic where half the tiles are missing. The clay tablet might be cracked, the papyrus nibbled by time, the ink faded to ghosts of letters, but even in their broken state, they demand to be heard. Take the famous Lament of the Sumerian Slave, a text discovered in Ur. At first glance, it appears to be a straightforward plea for better rations. But when linguists analyzed the dialect, they realized something startling. The scribe had written in a rare regional vernacular, one typically used in lullabies. That choice wasn't accidental. By framing suffering in the cadence of a child's song, the writer transformed a personal grievance into a communal cry, one that would resonate deeply with fellow captives from their homeland. Modern translations initially labeled it as a work song, smoothing its edges into something quaint. Only when scholars from the same cultural background recognized the lullaby's structure did the truth emerge. This wasn't just a complaint. It was a lullaby for the unborn, mourning generations that would never know freedom. The biases of preservation add another layer of distortion. Wealthy households kept archives, slave quarters rarely could. So while we have countless Roman dinner invitations etched in perfect cursive, we've lost most writings from the enslaved cooks who prepared those meals, except when they scratched messages into the bottoms of pots before firing them. Archaeologists call these kiln graffiti, fleeting protests preserved by chance. One from Pompeii reads, "The fish is spoiled, but he'll eat it anyway," a dark joke about the master's indifference. Without context, it could be mistaken for a simple kitchen note, but paired with similar finds. A Carthaginian amphora bearing the words, "They drink our tears," patterns emerge. These weren't random gripes, they were a shared language of resistance, one that scholars are only now learning to read. Technology is bridging gaps we once thought unbridgeable. Spectral imaging recently revealed a scrap of Egyptian linen, long dismissed as blank. Under infrared light, Coptic letters surfaced, a prayer for a child sold away, written in onion juice ink by a mother who knew her words would vanish after reading. The very impermanence was the point. She never expected us to see it. She wrote because the act itself defied silence. Similarly, AI-assisted language models are reconstructing dialects considered lost. A team in Cyprus used machine learning to decode fragmented Phoenician inscriptions from enslaved shipbuilders, discovering that what scholars had labeled as accounting marks were actually abbreviations for gods from their homeland, tiny acts of spiritual preservation amid forced labor. Yet for all our tools, some barriers remain visceral. How do you translate the hesitation in a letter where the stylus pressed too deep, betraying a scribe's trembling hand, or the significance of a Babylonian tablet that switches midway from cuneiform to a personal shorthand, not for secrecy, but because the writer's fingers were too swollen from beatings to form proper wedges? These physical traces force us to confront the bodies behind the texts. A Greek slave's contract from Delphi includes an unusual clause. The scribe is permitted to rest his wrists 1 hour per day. At first, historians assumed this reflected rare kindness. Then they noticed the same clause in other contracts from the same owner. The truth was darker. His slaves developed chronic pain from writing so much. Comparing these struggles across cultures reveals both heartbreaking universality and striking ingenuity. In the Andes, quipu knotted cords used for record-keeping may have encoded subversive messages by altering knot sequences. Chinese oracle bones from the Shang dynasty show divination texts where the scribe's personal additions creep into the margins. The king asks about rain, but I ask about my daughter. Even the Rosetta Stone, that icon of translation, has a shadow narrative. The demotic script at its base, often overlooked in favor of the flashier hieroglyphs, contains subtle variants from standard bureaucratic language. Some scholars now believe these were inserted by Egyptian scribes chafing under Greek rule, a quiet assertion of identity in the very document that would later erase their writing system. The act of interpreting these fragments becomes an ethical tightrope. Do we correct the grammar of an enslaved child's first attempt at writing, or preserve its errors as proof of stolen education? When a prayer from a Carthaginian salt mine ends mid-sentence, do we speculate or let the silence speak? Every choice in reconstruction is also one of respect for the lives fragmented across these surfaces and for the truths they risked everything to etch into eternity. Across continents and centuries, the writings of the enslaved echo with an eerie familiarity, not because their experiences were identical, but because the human spirit bends against oppression in strikingly similar ways. A Babylonian clay tablet from 1700 BC bears a lament that could have been sung in the cotton fields of Mississippi. They brought me to a land where the rivers flow backward, where my tongue is heavy as stone. Half a world away, 3,000 years later, a Yoruba man enslaved in Brazil carved the same sentiment into the wall of a sugar mill. The waters here do not know my name. Both writers used the metaphor of unruly rivers to describe the disorientation of forced displacement, a shared literary device spanning millennia. This wasn't coincidence, it was survival strategy. Enslaved scribes from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica developed parallel techniques to preserve truth under surveillance. The Sumerian practice of hiding subversive marks in temple inventories finds its mirror in the quilts of the Underground Railroad, where geometric patterns doubled as maps. An Assyrian slave's cuneiform diary describes counting footsteps to memorize escape routes, just as 19th century Jamaican maroons notched runaways' paths into calabash gourds. Even the materials tell a story: pressed reeds for Babylonian clay, charcoal on plantation walls, berry ink on birch bark. Whatever was at hand became a vessel for memory. The most haunting parallels emerge in music. A Hurrian hymn from 1400 BCE, likely composed by enslaved musicians in Ugarit, pairs lyrics about carrying the master's burden with a melody based on a Phrygian scale, the same tonal structure later used in African American work songs to mask double meanings. Spirituals like Wade in the Water and ancient Egyptian harvest chants both employed water imagery as coded references to liberation. Researchers at the University of Ibadan recently demonstrated that certain call and response patterns in Igbo funeral dirges share rhythmic structures with Greco-Roman slave chants documented by Plutarch. When oppression stifles direct speech, rhythm becomes a secret handshake across time. These connections reveal more than shared suffering. They show how marginalized communities independently developed parallel systems of knowledge preservation. The quipu knots of Andean slaves and the mnemonic bead strings of West Africa both turned everyday objects into archival tools. A Phoenician slave's ledger from Carthage and a Virginian butler's account book from 1850 contain identical anomalies, deliberate errors in tallying that redirected resources to the enslaved. The universality of these tactics suggests something profound, that the oppressed have always been history's most innovative archivists, transforming even their chains into pens. Yet within these global patterns, gender carved distinct pathways. Enslaved women often recorded history through mediums deemed non-threatening by their captors, embroidering rebellion into tapestries, composing lullabies with covert lyrics, or leveraging their roles as cooks to encode messages in recipe traditions. A Babylonian midwife's birth records hid the names of rebel leaders in columns of infant weights. A Sufi enslaved poetess in medieval Spain wove critiques of the caliph into wedding songs. Their writings remind us that resistance wears many faces, some whispered into the ears of children, others stitched into the very fabric of daily life. Women's voices among enslaved historians carry a particular weight, not just because they survived, but because they thrived in spaces designed to erase them. Consider the paradox of a medieval convent where enslaved women, often captured in raids or sold into service, were tasked with copying sacred texts. To the outside world, their labor was invisible, their hands merely instruments of piety. But look closer at the margins of those illuminated manuscripts, and you'll find traces of rebellion. A 12th century Psalter from Germany, for example, depicts the usual saints and martyrs, but hidden in the vinework are tiny, meticulous portraits of women grinding ink, weaving cloth, even leading processions. These weren't random doodles, they were signatures of a kind, a way to say, "We were here." The risks these women took were staggering. In cultures where female literacy was often forbidden or dismissed, writing at all was an act of defiance. Add enslavement to that equation, and every stroke of the pen became a potential death sentence. Take the case of an anonymous scribe in Moorish Spain, who sewed fragments of her poetry into the hem of her mistress's gown. The verses, discovered centuries later, describe her longing for a daughter she'd been forced to leave behind. "The ink is my milk, the parchment her cradle." She couldn't send letters or carve her words into walls, so she turned the very garments of her captivity into a hidden archive. Enheduanna, the Sumerian high priestess often called history's first named author, may not have been enslaved, but her influence rippled through generations of captive women. Her hymns to Inanna, filled with themes of exile and resilience, were copied and adapted by enslaved scribes in Babylonian temples. One tablet from Sippar reworks Enheduanna's famous exaltation of Inanna into a lament for displaced weavers. "You who stand at the loom, remember the goddess sees your knots." It's a subtle but radical shift, taking a text meant to glorify power and repurposing it to honor the labor of the unseen. The gendered nature of these writings reveals itself in unexpected ways. Men's clandestine texts often focused on collective resistance or escape. Women's writings frequently centered on preserving kinship and cultural memory. A Coptic weaving manual from Byzantine Egypt, ostensibly a technical guide, doubles as a family history. Each pattern change corresponds to a birth, death, or marriage in the scribe's lineage. Similarly, the so-called kitchen tablets of ancient Rome, dismissed for centuries as household accounts, have recently been decoded as multilingual recipe books that also served as oral history repositories. A list of ingredients for fish sauce might include a stanza from a Gallic lullaby or instructions for a childbirth amulet, ensuring domestic knowledge survived across generations. Modern historiography has often overlooked these contributions, dismissing them as domestic or devotional rather than historical. But new scholarship is piecing together a different narrative. Infrared scans of a Palermo convent's choir books revealed layers of erased text beneath the Latin hymns, prayers in Jais, a language spoken by enslaved Ethiopian women. Their words, once deemed unimportant, now rewrite our understanding of medieval African diaspora communities. Similarly, the sister books of German nunneries, long studied for their religious content, are being re-examined for their coded accounts of slave uprisings and covert networks. What makes these women's writings so vital isn't just their content, but their methodology. Men might have carved their protests into stone, women stitched theirs into the fabric of daily life. A Byzantine silk fragment, woven with gold thread, spells out a curse against a slave trader in its border, a message only visible when the cloth catches light at a certain angle. A Korean concubine's memoir, hidden inside a hollow hairpin, recounts not just her suffering but the names of every woman sold alongside her. These weren't passive records, they were active acts of preservation, ensuring that even if the individuals were forgotten, their communities would endure. The challenge for historians today is to listen without imposing modern expectations. A Kashmiri slave's embroidery might encode lunar calendars for planting crops, not as a scientific treatise, but as a mother's letter to a daughter she'd never see again. When we read these texts only for factual data, we miss their deeper purpose, to affirm humanity in a world that denied it. Now, as we turn to the role of these writings in reshaping modern historiography, we must ask not just what they tell us about the past, but how they demand we rethink the very nature of historical evidence. Mainstream history books love their clean narratives, great men making great decisions, empires rising and falling in neat arcs. But what happens when you hold those narratives up to the light and see the fingerprints of the enslaved pressing through the parchment? Take Rome's so-called Golden Age. Official records praise Augustus for bringing peace and prosperity, but a wax tablet found near Pompeii tells another story. Written by an enslaved accountant, it details how the emperor's grand building projects were fueled by starving laborers who collapsed mid-shift, their bodies tossed into the mortar. This isn't just a footnote, it's a seismic crack in the foundation of how we've been taught to see antiquity. The same pattern repeats across civilizations. Egyptian pharaohs commissioned grandiose temple inscriptions boasting of divine favor, while the Leiden papyrus scrawled by a temple scribe records workers whispering that the gods had abandoned them during a drought. Even the Bible's Exodus story takes on new dimensions when read alongside Babylonian slave petitions describing eerily similar plagues and escapes. These aren't coincidences, they're proof that history's losers were documenting their truths all along, just in ways power structures couldn't easily erase. Modern projects like the U.S. Slave Narratives Initiative didn't invent this practice, they inherited it. When formerly enslaved Americans like Frederick Douglass wrote their memoirs, they were tapping into an ancient tradition of resistance literature, one that stretches back to cuneiform tablets and hieroglyphic graffiti. What makes these texts so revolutionary isn't just their content, but their mere existence. For centuries, historians dismissed enslaved accounts as unreliable, too emotional, too fragmented. But consider the irony. We trust Roman Senator Tacitus's histories despite his open disdain for Christians and foreigners, yet question the accuracy of a Nubian scribe's first-hand account of Ramses' reign. The bias here isn't in the sources, it's in the scholars holding the magnifying glass. Now, advanced archaeology is flipping the script. Spectral imaging of a palimpsest in Constantinople revealed a 9th-century enslaved nun's chronicle beneath a later hagiography. Her version of Emperor Basil's reign describes him bribing Bulgar mercenaries, a detail official histories omit. Suddenly, Basil's famous military genius looks more like financial desperation. This shift isn't just academic, it's reshaping classrooms. When students in London examine the fall of Rome, they no longer just read Edward Gibbon's 18th-century theories. They analyze letters between enslaved farm managers warning of crop failures, or graffiti from Ostja's docks describing grain shipments diverted to the wealthy. These fragments paint a picture not of barbarian hordes toppling civilization, but of an empire rotting from within, starved by inequality and mismanagement. Similarly, new translations of Aztec codices reveal that what Spanish conquistadors called rebellions were often organized strikes by enslaved featherworkers demanding fair wages. The conquistadors wrote history as a conquest. The codices tell it as a labor dispute. Yet as we center these voices, ethical questions emerge. Is it right to publish a prayer tablet meant only for a Babylonian mother's private grief? Should we display love letters between enslaved lovers, once hidden in a Carthaginian wall, now exposed in museum vitrines? These texts survived because their authors trusted them to secrecy, a trust modern scholarship must navigate with care. The same technology that resurrects their words also risks turning their pain into spectacle. Perhaps the ultimate lesson these historians offer isn't just how to document oppression, but how to honor the sacred boundaries around suffering. Their words survived by hiding. We owe them the dignity of choosing when to step into the light. These fragile texts, preserved against all odds, now face a new battleground, not against time or tyranny, but against the ethics of modern scholarship. When a Babylonian slave's prayer tablet sits behind museum glass, who really benefits? Some curators argue display cases honor the writer's courage, granting them the recognition their era denied. Yet descendants of enslaved communities often ask, isn't this just another form of extraction? The same hands that once toiled under whips now watch as their ancestors' pain becomes a spectator sport, admission tickets sold beside gift shop trinkets. Repatriation debates grow fiercer with each new discovery. A Kushite scribe's diary, looted during colonial excavations, currently resides in a Berlin museum, its pleas for home now trapped under climate-controlled lights. Meanwhile, digital archivists champion open access projects, scanning shackled fingers' etchings into searchable databases. But here's the uncomfortable question. Does digitizing a Nubian mother's lament for her stolen child make it more accessible or just easier to appropriate? Even the language of metadata matters. Tagging these works as slave narratives risks reducing lived agony to academic categories, while softer euphemisms like servitude writings sanitize brutality. Contemporary artists have emerged as crucial mediators in this tension. Painter Kerry James Marshall reimagines Roman graffiti left by enslaved gladiators, transforming fragmented phrases into towering murals that dominate gallery walls, forcing viewers to confront scale these writers were denied. Poet Ocean Vuong translates Assyrian brick inscriptions into spoken-word performances, his voice cracking at the same syllables where ancient styluses once trembled. These creators don't just reference history, they channel its unhealed wounds, asking who has the right to retell trauma. The most provocative interventions come from artists directly descended from enslaved scribes. Nigerian calligrapher Victor Ehekemna uses traditional uli motifs to overwrite colonial-era documents, his ink literally obscuring auction records with patterns from his ancestors' ritual scarification. In Brazil, visual artist Rossana Paulino stitches archival photos of enslaved wet nurses into linen, then deliberately stains the fabric with rust, a metaphor for how historical preservation corrodes even as it conserves. Their work embodies a radical principle. These narratives aren't relics to be studied, but living texts that demand participation. Perhaps the way forward lies in letting these documents dictate their own terms. When Yale historians digitized the memoirs of Venture Smith, an 18th-century man who purchased his freedom and meticulously documented his life, they collaborated with his descendants to password protect certain passages. Family rituals described in those pages remain accessible only to bloodline relatives, honoring boundaries the writer himself might have recognized. Similarly, a groundbreaking exhibit in Cape Town displays Khoisan slave letters alongside empty frames, acknowledging fragments too sacred for public view. This isn't just about respecting the past, it's about rectifying power imbalances that persist in libraries and lecture halls. The same institutions that once denied literacy to the enslaved now profit from their words. But change whispers through the stacks. At Howard University's Moreland Spingarn Center, students handle 19th-century slave narratives while listening to oral histories from living community elders, blurring the line between research and remembrance. In Dublin, a crowdsourcing project invites the public to transcribe convict scribbles from Australia's penal colonies, but every submission triggers a donation to Indigenous literacy programs. The ethical tightrope stretches beyond academia when a TikTok trend romanticizes ancient slave poetry without context, or auction houses sell Phoenician slave contracts as rare antiquities. We replicate the very systems these writers resisted. Yet when a high school in Atlanta stages plays based on Pompeian graffiti, with scripts co-written by descendants of sharecroppers, something profound occurs. The voices silenced for millennia finally dictate their own spotlight, not as specimens, but as sovereign storytellers. The clay tablets and hidden hymns that survived fire and whip now face their greatest test: our willingness to listen without appropriating, to amplify without exploiting, to honor without fetishizing. The scribes risked everything to be heard. How we handle that privilege will write the next chapter of their story. Now, consider the stained glass windows of medieval Europe, often attributed to master artisans, but recent restorations reveal fingerprints in the lead came, tiny imperfections suggesting enslaved glaziers left deliberate marks. These subtle signatures, invisible from cathedral floors, only catch light at certain hours. Like the texts we've explored, they demand we shift our angle of vision, learning to see history not from the galleries of power, but through the cracks where the oppressed inscribed their truth. Toni Morrison didn't just write Beloved, she channeled centuries of silenced voices into a single, searing narrative. When Seth's back bears the scars of a whip, it echoes the Babylonian slave who carved his suffering into wet clay. This is the power of modern reinterpretations. They don't merely reference history, they resurrect its breath. Artists today are doing what those ancient scribes risked their lives for, taking fragments and making them whole. Kehinde Wiley's portrait series, The Scribble Archive, reimagines enslaved chroniclers as Renaissance saints, their quills poised like scepters. In one painting, a black Moses inscribes not commandments, but the names of drowned Middle Passage victims onto parchment made from indigo-stained cotton. The medium itself becomes testimony, just as those Babylonian bricks hid prayers in their clay. Literature has become a battleground for these reclaimed narratives. Marlon James' The Book of Night Women reconstructs the lost diaries of Jamaican rebels, his prose mimicking the hurried, coded style of plantation graffiti. Similarly, Yojayosi's Hamigoing mirrors the structural ingenuity of ancient palimpsests, each chapter a layer, revealing how trauma etches itself across generations. These authors aren't just inspired by enslaved historians, they've become their literary successors, using fiction to archive what official records erased. Even poetry bends to this purpose. Claudia Rankine's Citizen embeds snippets of Greco-Roman slave epitaphs between modern vignettes of microaggressions, drawing a direct line from ancient marketplace insults to today's racial violence. The effect is jarring, proof that these voices were never truly past tense. Visual artists push the conversation further by literalizing absence. Kara Walker's shadow sculptures silhouette the gaps in historical archives, while Titus Kafar's shredded canvases mimic the fragmentary nature of recovered slave texts. In his Behind the Myth of Benevolence, A portrait of Thomas Jefferson peels away to reveal charred scraps of plantation ledgers beneath, a technique inspired by the layered wax tablets of Roman slaves. Meanwhile, ceramicist Thesta Gates crafts vessels from Mississippi River clay, imprinting them with phrases borrowed from Pompeian slave graffiti. When fired, the words blur like half-remembered songs, embodying how history distorts even as it preserves. Performance art breathes life into these static fragments. In the auction block cantata, composer Tania Leon sets Assyrian slave contracts to music, her dissonant chords mirroring the jagged cuneiform strokes. Dancer Akram Khan's Xenos reinterprets a Mesopotamian scribe's wrist injury as contemporary repetitive strain, his body convulsing as if still etching clay after 3,000 years. These works don't just honor enslaved historians, they physically reconnect with their labor, turning audiences into witnesses of endurance. The digital realm offers new frontiers for this dialogue. Instagram poet Morgan Parker's #SlaveCrib series superimposes tweets over images of Sumerian tablets, highlighting how modern Black exhaustion rhymes with ancient exhaustion. Video game Never Alone, developed with Inupiat elders, adapts indigenous storytelling techniques that mirror enslaved scribes' oral preservation methods, knowledge passed through playable snowstorms rather than whispered hymns. Even TikTok has become an unlikely archive where teens stitch together readings of Pompeian slave letters with footage of BLM protests, proving these texts aren't relics but rallying cries. What unites these works is imaginative empathy, the willingness to dwell in history's silences and speak from within them. When Julie Meritu's abstract maps trace the migration routes described in Nubian slave letters, or when Lynn Nottage's play, Ruined, echoes the coded complaints of Roman textile workers, they're not just creating art. They're fulfilling the original intent of those who wrote under threat. Make sure the story doesn't end here. Now, as we turn to education, consider this every time a teacher passes out a worksheet with Toni Morrison's words beside a Babylonian lament. They're continuing a chain of custody older than the pyramids. The classroom, like the artist studio, becomes a place where these voices finally get the audience they deserved. Classrooms are becoming laboratories for historical justice, where students don't just learn about the past, they actively reclaim it. In a Maryland high school, teenagers pore over multispectral scans of Roman wax tablets, not as passive observers but as amateur epigraphers, deciphering the faint indentations left by enslaved scribes. Their teacher, Dr. Elena Ruiz, designed the curriculum around a simple premise. If we can train algorithms to read these texts, why not train students to question who wrote them? One assignment challenges kids to compare a pharaoh's official victory stela with the graffiti found in workers' quarters, spotting the discrepancies between propaganda and lived experience. The results are transformative. A sophomore named Jaden recently noticed that a Babylonian king's boast of contented servants appeared on the same clay tablet as a scribe's tiny footnote, "The children cry for bread." Suddenly, history wasn't a monologue from the powerful, but a dialogue across millennia. Yet, integrating these materials isn't without hurdles. Many textbooks still relegate enslaved voices to sidebars or alternative perspectives, as if they're optional footnotes rather than central narrators. Dr. Ruiz recalls the pushback she faced when proposing to replace a chapter on Roman engineering marvels with primary accounts from the enslaved laborers who built them. Some argued it was too complex for teenagers, she says, but kids understand injustice instinctively. When they read a Carthaginian child's letter, father was beaten for dropping a brick, they don't need a PhD to grasp its significance. Innovative educators are bridging this gap through experiential learning. At UCLA's Digi Lab, students use 3D printed replicas of cuneiform tablets to physically trace the grooves left by enslaved scribes, feeling the pressure variations that suggest haste or fear. In Louisiana, a middle school history teacher turned the classroom into a mock archaeological site, burying fragments of translated slave petitions in sandboxes. As kids piece together phrases like, "We petition for one day's rest," they're not just learning paleography, they're internalizing the stakes of preservation. Even gaming has entered the space. A modder recently adapted Assassin's Creed Origins to include quests based on real Ptolemaic-era slave letters, letting players deliver clandestine messages between virtual plantations. The ripple effects extend beyond history class. A Boston Latin school project analyzing mathematical errors in Sumerian tax records revealed how enslaved accountants subtly shortchanged temples to redistribute food. Now, those same students scrutinize modern budgets for disparities. It's not just about ancient history, says math teacher Carlos Mendez. It's about recognizing systems of control and the quiet ways people resist them. This interdisciplinary approach is gaining traction. In Georgia, a language arts unit has students compose reply poems to enslaved scribes, weaving their own experiences with systemic inequity into the ancient text's themes. One seventh grader wrote back to the Babylonian boy who etched "I miss my mother's voice" into a brick. "They took your language too / but your words found me / like seeds in cracked earth." Technology is amplifying these efforts but not replacing the human connections they spark. A Stanford-developed AI now helps classrooms transcribe faded Coptic texts, but teachers emphasize the tool's limitations. The algorithm spots letters, explains Professor Nia Wallace, but students spot the grief in a scribe's shaky O or the hope in a hurried amen. Machines parse data. Kids parse meaning. Perhaps the most profound tool is the simplest: space for reflection. After reading a Pompeian slave's grocery list that included hemlock for the master's tonic, one class debated whether it was evidence of poisoning or just dark humor. The discussion lasted 2 periods. That's the point, says Wallace. These texts don't give easy answers. They demand critical engagement with the messy, aching humanity of the past. As these practices spread, they're challenging pedagogical norms. Why memorize battle dates when you can reconstruct a day in the life of the enslaved cook who fed the troops? Why prioritize polished essays over raw, emotional responses to a mother's plea carved into a Carthaginian wall? The classroom is no longer just a place to consume history. It's becoming a site of restitution, where students don't just learn about silenced voices, but help amplify them. And as they do, they're writing the next chapter in a story those ancient scribes risked everything to begin. Now, the tools unlocking these stories are evolving faster than ever. From AI that resurrects faded ink to virtual reality that reconstructs scribble schools, technology is giving us unprecedented access to the past, but also raising urgent questions about who gets to control these narratives. The answers may determine whether these voices are truly liberated or simply placed in new kinds of chains. Digital tools are cracking open history's vaults in ways we never imagined possible, breathing life into texts once considered lost forever. Take the groundbreaking work at the University of Kentucky, where AI algorithms are reassembling fragments of Babylonian slave petitions like a high-stakes jigsaw puzzle. These aren't just scattered clay shards anymore, they're becoming coherent narratives. One program, trained on thousands of cuneiform symbols, recently identified a pattern across tablets from different cities, recurring phrases about the weight of the sun that scholars now believe was code for forced labor in scorching brick kilns. The technology doesn't stop at reconstruction. Machine learning can detect subtle shifts in handwriting pressure, revealing which lines a scribe wrote under duress. A letter from a Roman estate manager, long assumed to be dictation, showed tremors in the Greek portions but steady strokes in Latin, evidence the enslaved writer was translating his own thoughts into his master's language, word by painful word. Projects like Enslaved.org are turning these discoveries into living history. This digital archive doesn't just catalog names from plantation records or ship manifests. It maps connections between them, showing how a woman sold in Charleston might appear years later in a Brazilian priest's diary as a midwife delivering babies under a new name. The real power lies in its crowd-sourced model. When a librarian in Senegal uploaded 17th-century Arabic documents describing Wolof captives, the system cross-referenced them with Spanish port logs, revealing an entire network of trans-Saharan slave routes previously known only through oral tradition. Suddenly, family histories stretched across continents became traceable with a few clicks. But the digital revolution isn't just about scale, it's about intimacy. Spectral imaging at Oxford's Bodleian Library recently uncovered a heartbreaking example, a Coptic prayer book with faint charcoal underdrawings of children's faces. Further analysis showed the pigment contained traces of salt and olive oil materials. An enslaved scribe likely scavenged from a monastery kitchen to sketch portraits of siblings taken to another province. These aren't just data points, they're emotional fingerprints. Similarly, 3D modeling of Egyptian ostraka pottery fragments used for writing can now detect the angle at which a stylus was held, telling us whether the writer was right-handed or left, a small detail that transforms anonymous scratches into human identities. Yet with every breakthrough comes ethical quandaries. When an algorithm reconstructs a shredded letter between enslaved lovers, who owns those words? Some institutions treat deciphered texts as academic trophies, while descendant communities argue they're stolen heirlooms finally coming home. The Nova Scotia Archives offers a compelling compromise. Their digitized Book of Negroes, a ledger of Black loyalists evacuated after the American Revolution, includes an open annotation feature. Visitors can add family oral histories directly to the digital margins, creating a dialogue between 18th-century clerks and 21st-century grandchildren. It's history as conversation, not monologue. The most profound transformations happen at the intersection of tech and tradition. In Benin, linguists are collaborating with Vodun priests to train AI on coded phrases in colonial-era court records. The priests recognized certain repetitions as covert references to Orisha deities, a discovery that unlocked hundreds of petitions disguised as mundane complaints. Meanwhile, Rutgers University's Freedom on the Move project enlists volunteers to transcribe runaway slave ads, but with a twist: participants can tag emotions in the descriptions. What was once a cold archival exercise becomes an act of collective witnessing when you highlight phrases like "speaks softly" or "walks with head high" and label them dignity. What emerges from these efforts isn't just better scholarship, it's a new relationship with the past. Holding a zoomable 4K scan of a Kushite slave's contract, you notice things no textbook mentions: a thumbprint smudging the ink near the price, a dried tear warping the papyrus fibers. Digital humanities don't distance us from history, they collapse the centuries between then and now. When a high schooler in Detroit traces the GPS coordinates of a 19th century freedom seeker's journey on her phone, she's not just learning about resistance, she's navigating its very geography. The true promise of this technology lies ahead. Experimental projects are pushing boundaries. Holographic recreations of scribble schools where visitors can sit beside virtual enslaved copyists, or blockchain systems that permanently encrypt freedmen's letters to prevent future erasure. But amid the innovation, one principle remains sacred: these tools must serve the descendants first. At Howard University's Moreland Spingarn Center, community elders vet every digital reconstruction before publication, ensuring the dignity of their ancestors isn't sacrificed for high-tech spectacle. After all, the enslaved wrote for liberation, not display cases. Their words survived fire and flood, not to become museum pieces, but to finally be heard. Behind every algorithm and database entry pulse personal stories too urgent to remain artifacts. Consider the Roman wax tablet recently decoded in London, a shopping list that, when viewed through hyperspectral imaging, revealed an earlier message. If you find this, tell Licinia I kept my promise. Licinia's name appears in no history book, but thanks to a machine that sees what human eyes cannot, her faithfulness now echoes louder than emperor's decrees. This is the heart of the digital revolution, not just recovering texts, but restoring the heartbeat within them. That thumbprint pressed into Mesopotamian clay isn't just a signature, it's a heartbeat. For a moment, the nameless scribe steps out of the shadows, their ridges and walls defying time's erasure. This is how we begin reconstructing lives thought lost, not through grand monuments, but through intimate traces. Take the Babylonian tablet signed by a scribe named Kidon Marduk, who appended his title with the phrase, "son of a nobody." At first glance, it reads like self-effacement. But read it again. This wasn't humility, it was defiance. In a society where lineage meant everything, claiming to be nobody's child was a radical act of self-creation. His words survive because he baked them into bricks for the king's palace, literally embedding his identity into the foundations of power. Then there's the Athenian slave scribe whose shaky handwriting betrays more than poor training. Forensic analysis of wax tablets reveals grooves where his stylus slipped not from clumsiness, but from the tremors of malnutrition. We know his work because he copied legal documents for his master's firm. But between the lines, he left something else, faint doodles of ships in the margins. Maritime archaeologists matched these crude sketches to wreckage patterns near Piraeus, suggesting he'd once been a sailor before capture. His drawings weren't idle distractions, they were maps of a life before chains. The most haunting reconstructions emerge from mundane records. A Roman estate ledger from Capua lists purchases of ink, parchment, and one literate Gaul, price 30 denarii. That dry notation hides a story. Cross-referencing with gladiator school rosters reveals the Gaul, likely captured during Caesar's campaigns, was later sold to a scriptorium. There he transcribed epic poems about Roman conquests by day while etching Celtic Ogham script into the wax at night. Scholars only noticed the hidden layer when sunlight hit the tablet at an angle, exposing grooves that formed entirely different letters underneath. His biography exists in that palimpsest, a man forced to glorify his conquerors while clinging to his language in secret. These fragments do more than humanize the past, they rewrite our understanding of historical agency. When a Nubian scribe in Egypt slipped the phrase, "the river remembers," into a royal decree, he wasn't just being poetic. Hydrological records show he wrote it during a drought, subtly reminding Pharaoh that the Nile's failures were as much part of history as its floods. Likewise, the diary of a Korean concubine enslaved in Tang, China, survives because she sewed it into her silk underrobe. Her descriptions of palace intrigues are vivid, but the real revelation lies in the paper itself, mulberry fibers from her homeland, smuggled in as hair ornaments. Every page was an act of embodied memory. What emerges isn't just a collection of biographies, but a pattern of resistance through documentation. The scribe who tallied Athenian silver mines also notched worker deaths with tiny owl symbols. The city's emblem turned morbid tally mark. The Coptic nun who illuminated Gospels hid portraits of her enslaved family in the vinework, their faces visible only under ultraviolet light. These weren't passive record keepers. They were archivists of the oppressed, embedding counter-narratives in the very systems designed to erase them. Their influence ripples far beyond their lifetimes. Abolitionist pamphlets of the 18th century quoted Roman slave petitions as moral precedent. Haitian revolutionaries studied accounts of Spartacus's rebellion, not from Roman historians, but from fragments preserved by the gladiators' own scribes. The thread connecting these lives isn't just suffering, it's the deliberate, dangerous choice to turn writing into witness. When an anonymous Carthaginian scribe pressed his palm into wet clay beside his cuneiform, he left more than a fingerprint. He left a promise that history would never be monolithic, that even the most carefully curated archives would always contain whispers between the lines. Now, as we trace how these texts traveled across generations, we'll see how whispers became shouts and how the act of preservation itself became a form of liberation. The echoes of those ancient scribes don't just linger in museums, they pulse through the streets of modern movements. When protesters today chant, say their names, they're invoking the same practice as Babylonian slaves who etched the names of the fallen into wet clay, ensuring memory outlasted oppression. This isn't coincidence, it's continuity. The coded hymns of Sumerian temple workers find their rhythm in the protest songs of the civil rights era, where "wade in the water" carried directions for escape as surely as a cuneiform tablet's hidden map. The thread connecting them, a shared understanding. When power controls the official narrative, resistance lives in the margins. Consider how enslaved historians built communal archives, scattering fragments across potsherds, tapestries, and oral traditions, knowing no single document could tell the whole story. Today's activists mirror this with decentralized tactics, hashtags that aggregate testimonies, murals that multiply beyond censorship, or the way Black Lives Matter organizers use encrypted apps to preserve strategies from surveillance. The Babylonian scribe who buried his prayer in a brick and the Ferguson protester who scrawled, "I am a man," on a reclaimed storefront are kin across millennia. Both transformed everyday materials into weapons against erasure. Language itself becomes a battleground in this legacy. Just as Roman slaves subverted Latin grammar to smuggle critiques into official correspondence, modern movements reclaim derogatory terms or invent new vocabularies. The Nubian scribe who wrote, "The river runs backward," to describe forced migration would recognize the power in phrases like "alternative facts" or "the personal is political," linguistic jujitsu that flips oppression's script. Even the visual language of protest draws from ancient wells. The raised fist iconography of labor movements echoes the clenched hand symbols found on Pompeian slave collars, while the practice of die-ins mirrors Egyptian tomb art's staged scenes of collective mourning. What makes these connections more than poetic parallels is their tactical DNA. The enslaved Coptic weaver who stitched names into temple tapestries shares methodology with the AIDS memorial quilt, both using craft to force recognition of loss. The Roman slave's wax tablet, scraped clean for reuse but still bearing ghostly imprints of his true thoughts, finds its counterpart in digital activists' practice of screen burning, projecting censored messages onto buildings so they linger as afterimages. These aren't just acts of remembrance, they're blueprints for outmaneuvering power's short attention span. The most profound lesson lies in how these texts traveled. Ancient enslaved networks relied on trusted couriers, cooks slipping recipes with coded news, midwives carrying birth records as census substitutes. Modern movements operate similarly. Mutual aid spreadsheets that double as documentation of state neglect, or TikTok stitches that transform personal stories into collective testimony. When a first-century Greek tutor hid his students' exercises beneath revolutionary poetry, He anticipated the layered meaning of a protest sign that reads, "I can't breathe," over a schoolbook's pages. Both understand that survival sometimes means wearing the master's language like camouflage. This legacy challenges us to rethink what counts as historical evidence. The Pompeian bakery wall's charcoal scrawl, "The master feasts, we starve," was long dismissed as graffiti until scholars recognized it as part of a broader pattern of labor complaints. Similarly, dismissals of Twitter activism ignore how hashtags like #HashMeToo function as digital ostraca, fragmentary but collectively damning. The Babylonian scribe who tallied missing grain in temple records would understand the potency of today's crowdsourced police brutality databases, dry numbers that, when assembled, reveal systemic violence. Yet the greatest inheritance isn't technique, it's the audacity to believe fragile words can topple empires. When enslaved scribes pressed their palms into clay or stitched secrets into cloth, they gambled on a future they'd never see. Modern movements carry that same faith. The Palestinian poet who plants verses in olive groves, the Uyghur grandmother reciting genealogies into hidden recorders, they're not just preserving culture. They're speaking directly to those ancient chroniclers in the only language oppression never masters: stubborn, unbroken time. Now, as we turn to the linguistic alchemy that made these texts so potent, we'll see how enslaved historians didn't just use language, they remade it, bending grammar and symbol to serve liberation. Because when your words are monitored, every syllable becomes a smuggler's crate. Language was never just a means of communication for these scribes. It was a cloak, a weapon, a homeland carried between the teeth. Consider the Jewish captives in Babylon who defiantly wrote portions of the Book of Daniel in Hebrew, even as their captors demanded Aramaic. That choice wasn't practical, it was an act of spiritual guerrilla warfare. By embedding their sacred tongue into official records, they ensured that every administrative document became a silent protest, a fragment of Zion pressed into foreign clay. Centuries later in Brazil, Yoruba-speaking slaves would perform similar feats of linguistic resistance, inking Oroki praise poems to their orishas beneath Catholic hymns, their mother tongue pulsing beneath the surface like a second heartbeat. The physicality of these texts amplifies their defiance. A wax tablet from Roman Britain bears a Celtic curse inscribed in Latin letters, but if you run your fingers over the grooves, you'll feel where the stylus dug deepest on words like justice and blood, the anger fossilized in the medium itself. In Haiti, enslaved scribes took this further, mixing charcoal with sugarcane juice to create an ink that darkened over time, ensuring their Creole manifestos grew bolder with age rather than fading. These weren't just documents, they were timed revelations engineered to outlast their oppressor's gaze. Materials often betrayed hidden meanings. The Nubian scribe who penned petitions on ostraca pottery fragments chose shards from amphorae made in her homeland, each rough edge a tactile reminder of displacement. Similarly, the Congo artisans forced to illuminate medieval Christian manuscripts ground malachite from Central Africa into their pigments, embedding geography into the very colors of their captivity. Forensic analysis now reveals these material signatures, the clay of a Babylonian tablet containing trace elements from the scribe's village, or the papyrus fibers of an Egyptian will aligning with Nile wetlands where the writer's family once fished. Every stroke was a land claim in miniature. The body itself became a writing instrument. A Coptic weaver in Alexandria pricked her fingertips to stain linen with blood-red thread counts, turning textile production into a ledger of abuse. In Rome, enslaved tutors taught aristocratic children to form letters by guiding their hands while secretly pressing fingernail crescents into wax tablets to mark passages containing covert messages. Even something as mundane as a scribe's posture carried meaning. Assyrian reliefs depict captive scribes crouching to write, but cuneiform analysis shows their tablets were often rotated 90 degrees mid-text, a subtle signal that the writer's mind refused the master's orientation. These physical traces force us to read differently. The accounting errors in Sumerian temple records, once dismissed as carelessness, now appear as deliberate acts. A scribe recording 5 goats offered might etch the number 5 with one fewer wedge stroke, knowing the shortage would feed hungry children. Likewise, the uneven spacing in Roman slave contracts often concealed acrostics, where the first letters of each line spelled out warnings like flee or trust no one. The medium wasn't just the message, it was the conspirator. Perhaps most remarkably, these texts weaponized their own fragility. A Kushite prayer scroll from Mara was written in water-soluble ink on linen, meant to dissolve when washed, creating a ritual where words returned to the Nile that birthed them. In contrast, the Vindolanda tablets from Roman Britain survived precisely because they were discarded as trash, their mundane shopping lists preserving love letters between enslaved couples in the anaerobic mud. Survival sometimes meant being precious enough to preserve or insignificant enough to ignore. Now, as we examine the tools that resurrect these voices from oblivion, prepare to witness how modern technology is doing what no conqueror could, giving them the last word. The clay tablet pressed between your palms isn't just a surface for words, it's a silent witness to the hands that shaped it. Run your fingers along its edges, and you might feel the uneven ridges where an enslaved scribe's stylus slipped, the grooves deepening with frustration or haste. These textures tell stories the text alone cannot. Take the Babylonian school tablet etched with multiplication tables, seemingly mundane, until you notice the child-sized fingerprints fossilized in the margins, evidence of a young captive forced to learn his captor's math. Or the Roman wax tablet recycled so many times its surface holds ghostly imprints of shopping lists, love letters, and finally, a desperate plea for freedom layered like sedimentary rock. Every material choice was strategic. Papyrus scraps too small for official notices became clandestine diaries, while Ostraka broken pottery shards were the ancient equivalent of burner phones, their rough surfaces perfect for messages meant to be read once and shattered. Consider the ink itself. In Carthage, enslaved scribes mixed iron gall with pomegranate rind, creating a fluid that darkened from brown to black as it oxidized, a metaphor for truths that grew bolder with time. A Coptic weaver's ledger from Alexandria stuns researchers not for its inventory of linen, but for the blue stains on its edges, traces of indigo from her fingertips as she tallied bolts while dyeing cloth, her labor literally bleeding into the record. Even absence speaks volumes. The famous blank parchment from a Byzantine scriptorium revealed under ultraviolet light a scribe's charcoal underdrawings, figures of chained workers erased by a later hand, their shadows lingering like bruises beneath the gilded saints. The global journey of these materials adds another layer of meaning. A Phoenician slave's contract written on Egyptian papyrus, signed with a Mesopotamian cylinder seal, and stored in a Greek clay jar, embodies the brutal networks that dispersed both people and their words. Trade routes meant for spices and silk became conduits for subversive texts. A Tamil laborer's protest poem inked on Chinese paper folded into a Persian merchant's belt. A Berber shepherd's song transcribed onto a Roman wax tablet and carried across the Sahara in a salt caravan. These objects didn't just survive, they smuggled truth through the veins of empire. Perhaps most poignant are the makeshift archives. In the ruins of a Carthaginian tannery, archaeologists found scraps of leather punched with tiny holes, initially dismissed as defective goods until a conservator noticed the patterns matched Phoenician shorthand. Each hide was a tactile diary, the raised dots readable by touch for those forbidden literacy. Similarly, the so-called thread manuscripts of Peru, often mislabeled as decorative cords, encoded Quechua histories through knot sequences, their fibers spun from alpaca wool that still carries the DNA of the women who spun them. When we hold these objects today, we're not just reading history, we're touching the residues of lives that refuse to be silenced. The next time you see a cracked tablet or a stained parchment, look beyond the text. The chipped corner might mark where a scribe's shackles scraped the clay. The faint wine splotch could be the tavern table where a message changed hands. These materials were never passive. They were co-conspirators, their very substance whispering secrets across millennia. Now, as we trace the routes that carried these fragile rebellions from one corner of the ancient world to another, remember, every splinter, every tear, every smudged line is part of the story. Trade routes weren't just conduits for spices and silk. They became clandestine highways for forbidden words. Picture a Phoenician merchant ship anchored off Crete, its hull laden with Tyrian purple dye and cedar logs. But hidden between amphorae of olive oil, wrapped in linen and sealed with wax, lies something far more dangerous, a clay tablet from Babylon, its cuneiform script telling not of kings and conquests, but of a scribe's longing for his daughter, sold to a distant city. This tablet shouldn't have survived. It defied borders, language barriers, and the brutal economics of slavery. Yet here it was, passed hand to hidden hand from Mesopotamia to the Aegean, its journey mirroring the very displacement it lamented. The dispersal of these texts reads like a shadow history of ancient globalization. When Assyrian conquerors deported skilled scribes from Israel to Nineveh, they unknowingly created a network of subversive literacy. These captives forced to administer the empire that enslaved them began embedding Hebrew psalms into accounting records, their prayers masquerading as inventory lists. Centuries later, their descendants would adapt this practice in Roman scriptoria, weaving Aramaic proverbs into Latin legal codes. The parchment might bear the emperor's seal, but between the lines pulsed the whispers of the displaced. Africa's intellectual diaspora followed equally ingenious paths. Swahili porters carrying ivory to the Red Sea concealed palm leaf manuscripts in their loads, their Ajami script Arabic characters writing African languages preserving origin stories the slave trade tried to erase. In Constantinople, enslaved Ethiopian scholars translated Jazz Gospels for Byzantine bishops, while secretly compiling chronicles of Aksumite kings on scrap vellum. Even the Indian Ocean's monsoon winds carried more than trade goods. Maldivian cowrie shells strung as abacus beads often hid tiny scrolls inside, each bearing Tamil protest poetry from indentured laborers. Oral traditions turned geography into memory palaces. A griot in Mali might sing of Sundiata Keita's empire while subtly encoding routes to liberated villages. A Cherokee elder's creation story could double as a map to hidden mountain passes. These weren't just stories, they were living, breathing archives. When the transatlantic slave trade severed written lineages, the Congo cosmogram, a sacred symbol, resurfaced in Haitian Vive drawings and Virginia quilt patterns, its geometric language preserving cosmology across oceans. An Ashanti proverb etched on a Georgia plantation wall, "The moon moves slowly but it crosses the town," could trace its cadence back to gold-weight inscriptions in Kumasi. The resilience of these transmissions hinged on deliberate fragmentation, like the Jewish practice of burying damaged Torah scrolls rather than destroying them. Enslaved communities scattered their histories to ensure survival. A single Yoruba creation epic might exist across scattered mediums, a verse carved into a Cuban sugar mill's beam, a refrain woven into Bahian carnival rhythms, a character's name hidden in a Louisiana ledger's margin. Only when reassembled like the Ishin Denshin, telepathy practice of Japanese bondservants who split poems across stolen porcelain shards, does the full picture emerge. Now consider the humble fishing net, its knots tightened by generations of Bengali sea workers. To the Portuguese slavers who raided their villages, it was just a tool. But to those cast into the holds of ships, each knot's twist counted a stolen ancestor, each repaired tear marked a resistance. When historians decry the silences in enslaved histories, they miss the chorus of voices speaking through fiber, clay, and wind. The real miracle isn't that these texts survived, it's that they were never truly lost to begin with, only waiting for us to learn how to listen. Before the first stylus touched clay or ink met papyrus, history lived in the breath between generations, carried not on parchment, but in the rhythm of a lullaby, the call and response of a work song, the cadence of a bedtime story. Oral traditions weren't just a stopgap for the illiterate. They were a sophisticated, deliberate system of preservation designed to outsmart suppression. Take the sorrow songs of enslaved Africans in the Americas, where a melody about crossing the Jordan River secretly mapped escape routes north. This wasn't improvisation. It was an ancient practice with roots stretching back to Mesopotamian harvest chants, where the tempo of threshing songs encoded crop yields forbidden to record. The brilliance of oral history lies in its fluidity. A written tablet could be smashed, but a story reshapes itself with each telling, adapting to new contexts while guarding its core truth. In ancient Crete, captive Minoan scribes composed hymns to Zeus that, when sung in a particular dialect, doubled as genealogies of displaced families. Similarly, the griots of West Africa, often enslaved themselves, used epic poems like the Sanjata to preserve legal codes and land claims under the guise of entertainment. Their performances were living archives where a single vowel shift could mark the difference between a king's official lineage and the hidden history of a rebellion. Rituals transformed memory into collective muscle. The Eleusinian mysteries of Greece, often administered by enslaved priests, wove agricultural cycles with allegories of Persephone's abduction, a metaphor for their own forced migrations. Participants didn't just hear the story, they reenacted it through sacred dances whose steps mirrored the journey from freedom to captivity and back. Modern scholars realized these movements preserved nautical directions to Delos, a sanctuary for escaped slaves. The body itself became a manuscript, its motions inscribing survival knowledge deeper than any parchment could. The interplay between oral and written forms was often collaborative. A Sumerian temple hymn might praise the gods in cuneiform, while the enslaved choir performing it added verses naming the workers who built the ziggurat, their names surviving not in clay but in the oral canon of temple musicians. In Byzantium, illiterate laundresses starching liturgical vestments embroidered threads in patterns that corresponded to psalms, creating tactile hymns only the initiated could read. These weren't lesser histories, they were parallel texts, each reinforcing the other's truth. What oral traditions guarded best were the emotions written records often sanitized. No Babylonian tablet captures the tremor in a mother's voice as she sang her child to sleep with a lullaby about their pillaged village. But that song, passed down through generations in the Akkadian diaspora, preserved the grief official chronicles erased. Similarly, the Roman Carmen, a work song for enslaved rowers, encoded not just rowing cadence, but the visceral exhaustion of bodies chained to oars. When archaeologists reconstructed the rhythm from galley wreck inscriptions, they found it matched the stress fractures in the bones of drowned rowers. The body remembers what the text omits. The endurance of these unwritten texts challenges our very definition of historiography. A Cherokee Trail of Tears story cycle, maintained through 7 generations of women's sewing circles, carries the same evidentiary weight as a Roman senator's memoir, perhaps more, given its resistance to editorial censorship. Modern technology now confirms what oral cultures always knew. Neural studies show rhythmic storytelling activates memory centers of the brain more powerfully than rote memorization. Those enslaved Athenian scribes scratching laws onto stone, they likely learned them first through the call and response drills their Spartan captors used to teach the illiterate. As we turn to the philosophical contributions of these historians, remember, the greatest ideas often began not in the silence of a scriptorium, but in the communal space where voices intertwined, where every chorus of "Wade in the Water" was both a map and a manifesto, and every grandmother's fireside tale held the seeds of revolution. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher born in chains, didn't just ponder freedom, he lived its absence. His teachings, scribbled by a student since he refused to write them himself, cut to the bone. Freedom isn't given. It's claimed in the mind first. This wasn't abstract wisdom, it was survival strategy. While Roman elites debated ethics in marble villas, Epictetus spoke from the filthy floor of a Nicopolis lecture hall, his leg permanently crooked from a master's brutality. His famous dichotomy of control, what we can change versus what we must endure, wasn't philosophy. It was the blueprint a slave used to rebuild his soul after every whipping. But Epictetus wasn't alone. In the shadows of Athens, the enslaved philosopher Phaedo of Ilys turned his master's dinner parties into covert seminars. Forced to serve wine to Socrates' disciples, he absorbed their debates while pretending not to listen until one night, he corrected a syllogism mid-pour. His startled audience, including Plato, bought his freedom the next day, yet Phaedo's greatest lesson wasn't logic, it was his refusal to let bondage define intellect. His academy later rivaled Plato's, proving chains could shackle wrists but not curiosity. The brilliance of these thinkers lies in their radical repurposing of oppression. When the Babylonian slave scribe Kidin-Ninurta wrote, "The tablet remembers what the king forgets," he wasn't just recording history, he was asserting that truth outlasts tyrants. Similarly, the Stoic Musonius Rufus, exiled and enslaved under Nero, taught that suffering reveals character like fire purifies gold. His lectures, delivered while chained to a Roman outpost, redefined power. A man in rags who thinks freely is richer than an emperor haunted by fear. These weren't platitudes, they were psychological weapons forged in captivity. What's startling is how their ideas permeate modern thought without credit. Cognitive behavioral therapy's core principle that perception shapes reality echoes Epictetus's. Men are disturbed not by things, but by their views of them. The labor movement's mantra, "No chain binds the mind," traces back to Spartacus's Greek tutor, who etched it on wax tablets later melted down for legionary armor. Even the concept of speaking truth to power originates not with 20th century activists, but with the Ethiopian eunuch scholar Ebed Melech, who risked execution to correct the Babylonian king's ignorance in court records. Their greatest rebellion was claiming philosophy itself. In a world where slaves were legally non-persons, their very act of thinking was subversion. The Roman jurist Ulpian dismissed slave testimony as inherently unreliable, yet enslaved philosophers proved him wrong by out-arguing their masters. The Carthaginian logician Hasdrubal, forced to compute naval trajectories for his captors, deliberately miscalculated battle formations not through error, but by applying his own ethical calculus that war itself was irrational. His execution became a whisper network among Mediterranean slave communities, a cautionary tale about the price of intellectual defiance. These thinkers force us to redefine resilience. It wasn't just enduring lashings or hunger. It was the mental gymnastics of finding agency where none existed. The Syrian slave rhetorician Libanius composed speeches for his master's political career while smuggling critiques into the cadence, a pause here, an ambiguous phrase there, that planted doubts in listeners' minds. His survival tactic, making his words so compelling that erasing them would cost his owner prestige. The lesson transcends antiquity. Creativity flourishes not despite constraints, but because of them. Today, their legacy lives in unexpected places. The mindfulness app reminding you control your reactions owes its algorithm to stoic slave diaries. The whistleblower leaking documents despite threats channels the spirit of the Assyrian scribe who added cuneiform footnotes to royal decrees. The king commands, but the river still floods the poor. Their texts survived because they embedded wisdom in the mundane, a shopping list that's also a meditation on desire, a love letter doubling as a treatise on consent. To read them now is to inherit their stubborn light. When Epictetus said, "First say what you would be, then do what you have to," he wasn't offering self-help. He was describing how the enslaved built inner citadels no auction block could breach. Their philosophies weren't escapes from reality. They were lifelines thrown back to us across centuries, proof that the most powerful ideas often begin where freedom ends. The scratched words of an enslaved Babylonian scribe or the hidden hymns of a Coptic weaver aren't just relics, they're masterclasses in resilience, written by those who refused to let their stories die. These texts teach us that oppression doesn't erase agency, it forces creativity. Take the Sumerian temple worker who tallied stolen grain with deliberate errors, redirecting food to hungry children. His ledger wasn't just a record, it was a quiet revolution, proving that even the smallest acts of defiance can rewrite power. Today, that same principle lives in whistleblowers leaking documents or journalists publishing banned truths. The tools have changed, but the strategy remains. Use the system's own infrastructure to undermine it. Artistic expression emerges as another lifeline across millennia. The Roman slave who etched poetry into wet plaster or the Congo artisan who wove protest symbols into royal tapestries understood something profound. Beauty is a Trojan horse for survival. Modern parallels abound, from Iranian women dancing in defiance of hijab laws to Ukrainian musicians composing symphonies in bomb shelters. Like their ancient counterparts, these artists weaponize creativity, wrapping urgent messages in mediums too compelling to destroy. The lesson: identity survives when it's woven into something the oppressor can't afford to lose. Perhaps the most radical legacy lies in these writers' refusal to be reduced to victimhood. The Assyrian eunuch scholar Ashur-Reshishi didn't just catalogue royal decrees, he appended them with sarcastic footnotes, turning his bureaucratic role into satire. His modern equivalent might be the social media satirist mocking dictators through viral memes, or the enslaved Aigha poet whose verses surface on smuggled cell phones. Both understand that humor and irony are survival tools, ways to reclaim dignity while exposing absurdity. Personal resilience intertwines with collective memory in these texts. A single line from a Babylonian brick, "The river remembers," echoes in today's movements for reparations and historical justice. When descendants of enslaved people trace their lineage through plantation records or DNA tests, they're continuing a practice as old as those Nubian scribes who hid family trees in temple blueprints. The act of remembering becomes resistance, ensuring that systems built on erasure can never fully succeed. These voices also challenge our definitions of strength. We often picture resilience as loud defiance, but the Pompeian baker who tallied missing wages in charcoal, or the medieval nun who stitched her biography into altar cloths, show us the power of subtlety. Their endurance wasn't about dramatic gestures, it was the daily decision to leave a mark, however faint. In an age of performative activism, their example reminds us that change often happens in whispers. Journal entries preserved under floorboards, protest signs folded into library books, truths passed between trusted hands. So what do we do with this legacy? Start by listening differently. When you encounter an ancient text, ask not just what it says, but how it survived. The cracks in a Roman tablet might reveal where an enslaved child pressed too hard, desperate to be heard. Next, recognize your own role in this chain of custody. Share marginalized stories with the same care those scribes took, hiding their words. Amplify, don't appropriate. Finally, create your own testimonies. Journal, paint, code, or sing. Whatever medium lets you inscribe truth into the walls of your time. The enslaved historians didn't write for fame, they wrote for futures they'd never see. Now it's our turn to ensure their trust wasn't misplaced. Pick up your stylus. The next chapter is yours. The secret texts of enslaved historians don't just belong to the past, they're living conversations, urgent whispers reaching across time to reshape how we understand power, resilience, and truth. These voices, etched in clay and hidden in hymns, weren't just fighting for survival, they were rewriting history from the inside, one coded word at a time. Think about the Sumerian scribe who baked his prayer into a brick, or the Roman tutor who scratched poetry beneath his students' lessons. Their courage wasn't in grand gestures, but in the quiet certainty that someone, someday, would decipher their truths. What makes these texts so extraordinary isn't just their defiance, it's their creativity. Faced with annihilation, these writers turned every available surface into a canvas. Ledger margins became manifestos, laundry tags held love letters, even children's rhymes carried rebellion. A Babylonian nursery song about a mouse stealing a crown wasn't just a fable, it was a blueprint for overthrowing tyranny. The Coptic weaver stitching names into temple tapestries wasn't just crafting art, she was building an archive in plain sight. Their ingenuity forces us to ask, what does resistance look like in our own era? How do we document the stories that power tries to erase? These fragments also challenge us to rethink who gets to be called a historian. For centuries, history was written by the victorious kings, generals, the owners of quills and printing presses. But the enslaved scribes prove that history isn't just about the powerful, it's about the people who endured them. The Athenian slave transcribing speeches by day and riots by night, the Korean concubine sewing her memoir into a hairpin. They weren't bystanders, they were chroniclers, capturing the cracks in empires that official records smoothed over. Their work demands we expand our definition of evidence beyond scrolls and treaties to include charcoal graffiti, quilt patterns, even the cadence of a work song. Most importantly, these texts remind us that silence is never absolute. Even in the darkest corners of history, humanity finds a way to speak. The Nubian architect who hid complaints in temple measurements, the Haitian revolutionaries who studied Spartacus's tactics from smuggled tablets, they understood that oppression thrives on amnesia. Their words were weapons against forgetting, ensuring that future generations would know their suffering and their strength. Today, as we digitize their fragments and share their stories, we become part of that chain of memory, honoring their trust across millennia. So what do we do with this legacy? Start by listening differently to the stories whispered in margins, the truths buried in bureaucracy, the songs that carry more than melody. Then add your own voice, journal, create, document, because history isn't just something we study, it's something we make every time we choose to pay attention. These enslaved historians didn't write for fame or glory, they wrote for us. Now it's our turn to ensure their words keep breathing. Share in the comments which of these hidden histories resonated most with you. And if you're hungry for more untold stories, hit subscribe. We've got countless more journeys into the past where history isn't just told by the winners, but by those who refuse to lose. Together, let's keep these voices